Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Director, thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure to have you. I want to begin like the chairman did and compliment you on some things, because I think this is a better budget than last year. And I know you didn't have a lot of time last year. This shows that, and of course we complicated things for you at the end, and I think you've adjusted to that as well as you could. But I agree with what the chairman had to say. I appreciate the emphasis on defense. I appreciate the emphasis on border security. I appreciate the recognition that the opioid crisis is a crisis, and you're trying to move and respond that way. So that's something the President mentioned in the campaign, and I think deserves bipartisan praise and support. I like the idea there is more mandatory reforms in here than last time. I don't agree with them all, but I particularly like the Graham-Cassidy embrace. I think that that's an important initiative. It's going to take a while, but I think you're right to seize on it. And I also want to point to one particular area that I have interest in, because I chair the subcommittee, where you had one proposal last year. I think you've listened to some of the things that we had to say in that committee, and that's the National Institute of Health, where you've not only level funded, you actually have had a modest increase, and that's very important for us. It's very important, obviously, for the health and security of the American people, but it's even more important, in a sense, long-term, for bending the cost curve out there. I mean, we spend $259 billion a year in Medicaid looking after Alzheimer's patients. We have no cure. We have no way to really slow the progression. That's an area that we've made a lot of emphasis on the last 2 or 3 years. Honestly, it's the right thing to do. It's a humanitarian thing to do, but also, ultimately, if you don't get our hands on that disease, it'll be over $1 trillion on the line it's on by 2050. So, you know, preserving those initiatives is really important. You're to be commended on that. I want to engage you a bit in the time that I have left on an area that you've not addressed, and I'm not being critical of the President or anybody else, but I just want to offer a path forward, and that's Social Security, to pick up a little bit on the discussion we just had. We all know politically that is a very sensitive and difficult area to address, so I'm never too critical. The last president didn't do anything to address Social Security. The last one that tried, Mr. Bush, got savaged over it. But I think there's a way forward here, and I would just ask you to study it, and I wouldn't expect you to embrace it today. But Mr. Delaney and I have a bipartisan proposal that really goes back and mirrors what Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill, and Howard Baker did working together in 1983. And the idea is a commission, and people always argue they never work. Well, that one did. It was the Greenspan Commission. You know, Social Security was much closer to going bankrupt then than it is today. As a matter of fact, the reason we have it today is because of the work that commission did and the surplus that was piled up in the intervening years until finally the baby boomer generation began to retire, and they're now drawing it down pretty rapidly. I think an opportunity exists to do that again. If we could reform something like that, and again, Mr. Delaney and I have presented this for 3 consecutive Congresses, I think this president could actually be the person who saved Social Security, who put it on firm footing, and it would be done in a very bipartisan way. I'd be the first to tell my friends on the other side of the aisle who are always concerned that this means slashing, go back and look at what Ronald Reagan did with that commission with Tip O'Neill. And by the way, Ronald Reagan the next year won re-election with 49 states, and Tip O'Neill remained Speaker of the House. So you can do this in a bipartisan way as long as you're protecting the program, because it's a popular program. But the way they did it is, frankly, they very gradually raised the age. I was 34. They told me, you're going to retire at 66, not 65. Your 1-year-old is going to retire at 67. They raised the cap, so they put more income in there as well. They made a modest increase in the deduction as well. In other words, there's a lot of little tweaks that could be done that would have huge advantage. So I would just ask you, in the time you have left, what thoughts you have going forward, because that's our biggest, most expensive, over $1 trillion program now, and we're either going to put it on firm footing or not.
A couple of different things, very briefly. We do make some small proposed changes to the SS program, not in retirement. We're talking about SSDI and SSI, and those have some marginal improvements on the state of the trust fund. But you're absolutely right. There's going to be a bigger issue to deal with, and I think the best point you make is that the longer that we put it off, you talk about making small changes, the longer you wait, the larger those changes must be. I would look forward to talking with you further about that. I also encourage you to look just as closely at Medicare and Medicaid, which are actually larger drivers of our deficit right now than Social Security are, and are probably a little bit more complicated to fix. But we can deal with those, and look forward to working with Congress on behalf of the administration.
Absolutely agree. Spoke with the Speaker about that last night. Yield back.